The title of my talk is Post-Traumatic Truth Disorder. And then there's an extra free part you're going to get, which was not in the program, because I changed it, I added it, and asymmetric intellectual warfare. So it's how the politicized appropriation of trauma is used to block open discourse. And I think this is very, very important because we all know there's a problem of open discourse. And so I'm coming in, I'm a trauma psychiatrist, as my work, so I'm trying to come in and re-diagnose the problem, understanding it from this perspective. And again, we diagnose in order to try to be able to do a better job of healing something and fixing it. So I think that if we try to understand this better. So the goals of this talk are to recognize the importance of the misuse of trauma concepts as a central tactic. And so I just want you to emphasize the word tactic here, because I worked as a reader on John Haidt's book on the coddling. So I was very aware of John Haidt's description, and I think a wonderful book about microaggressions and about the coddling and those kinds of problems. But there, it seemed to be more of an effect of something, right? There was an effect. Kids were seeing themselves in this vulnerable position. But I'm going to argue it's actually a tactic. So I want to examine intellectual, emotional, and strategic roles that are played by this political theater. And those of you who are from my generation remember political theater during the Vietnam protests as a very different kind of a political theater than this. So I want to recognize this as foundational in the larger strategy of asymmetric intellectual warfare. And so again, there's going to be two parts of this. One, talking about the misuse of trauma, and second, I'm going to make the argument that the misuse of trauma is actually part of a larger strategy, which is asymmetric, adopted from asymmetric warfare. And I'll explain what asymmetric warfare is as well. Okay, so we want to then finally, again, the idea is, and I'm going to do less of the last one, which is to pinpoint the vulnerabilities of this. I want to say that this pinpoints the vulnerabilities of the current pushback. If the pushback, I think, doesn't recognize this, that's a big claim, but I think it's true, then I think we're not going to be able to overcome it. But if we are, so again, for today's session, the solutions hopefully will be with my other speakers. So the roadmap is going to, I always feel obliged to put in a roadmap, but the roadmap is the things I just told you, so that's okay. What's the current university culture? We know it, right? For those of you who are not familiar with Carrie Nelson's recent book called Mindless, I think just the exceptional book on what happened on campus in the last 2 years. It's really a wonderful book. People familiar with Carrie Nelson? He was the president of the AAUP. And it was a really beautiful book on that. So we know what's going on. There's free speech. There's absence of tolerance of other opinions. Mutually interested in dialogue is all gone. Okay. So moreover, the last couple of years, there's an espousing of violent hate speech as a positive thing. Okay. So let's discuss how this came about. So I first want to start again with the identification of the misuse of trauma, and this can be interactive, guys. So, do I have a pointer here? Which one's the pointer? The red? Oh, the man's gone. So, oh, there it is. Yeah. Okay. So even before 10/7, Christine Rosen, she's a journalist. She argued that so she took John Haidt's argument a step further, and she argued that the elements of the science of trauma had been appropriated in order to turn trauma into a political tool. And she called this moving it into the battleground of the psyche, right? So the notable feature of the recent campus political discourse is adopt the language of trauma, including the self-representation of hyper-vulnerability, I'm vulnerable, and sensitivity to microaggression. Now here's the part. We have some lawyers in the room, so they can tell me I'm wrong or right, or elaborate on this. It claims that certain speech causes immediate and actual harm. Right now we know that free speech is a tenet, but that there are some exceptions of when you can overcome the free speech sort of the free speech as the given. And that's when it causes immediate natural law. I mean, that's the claim. So it's not just, oh, I'm vulnerable. The claim is, my vulnerability gives me the legal right to tell you to shut up because you are harming me, okay? So it claims actual medical harm. What is the medical harm? Re-traumatization. You are re-traumatizing me. Now again, I'm a trauma psychiatrist. I also do forensic work where I testify. I have been asked to testify in court cases when people claim trauma and claim this is trauma or it's not trauma. I had one case and a woman was being sued and she claimed that the lawsuit was causing her trauma. I pointed out to the judge that if we accept this, right, it's the end of the legal system. But she said no, she was traumatized, and she had some analyst write her a 50-page report explaining how she was traumatized by the lawsuit. I have to say I was on the stand for 15 minutes, and the judge said enough. I'm throwing this case out because clearly it was a bad thing, but it wasn't a trauma, right? So it's very important to understand, and it's very important to understand that this claim of re-traumatization. So maybe trauma is an example in which speech may be considered causal of medical harm. Maybe in real trauma, when an individual truly has trauma and is truly traumatized, and someone else is pushing on the specifics of that trauma, it is possible that we could consider that. And just to my background and why I'm talking about this, so after 9/11, our team at Columbia was responsible for treating all the cops and firefighters who were survivors. So we saw a lot of trauma, and I do understand the concept of re-traumatization. It is something that can happen. People can be triggered, but that's only under the conditions in which you actually have PTSD. Not under the conditions that you have had a trauma. Having had a trauma doesn't give you PTSD, right? And it's having PTSD is the precondition for re-traumatization. Is that clear? And most people think that trauma is the same thing as PTSD, and the language has been messed up. But only about 20% of the people who've had severe trauma actually get PTSD. Most people recover from most traumas, okay? PTSD is the exception. So, and only under a condition of actually having the diagnosis of PTSD does it make sense to talk about re-traumatization. So medical harm might be I'm saying medical harm justifies. I mean, this is their argument is that medical harm justifies limiting free speech. You compare this to the Supreme Court discussion of free speech limitations, fire in a crowded theater, right? So why is it okay to scream fire in a crowded theater? Well, it actually is if there's a fire, right? I mean, think about it, right? What's the difference between screaming fire in a crowded theater where there is a fire versus when there's no fire? Well, when there is a fire, you're obviously be saving lives, right? So when there's no fire, you'll have a stampede in either case, but in one case you'll save more lives that will be harmed, and in the other case you don't. So it is this immediate thing. The other condition in which the Supreme Court has recognized the ability to do it, it has to do with immediate incitements, right? And actually, fire in a theater is in some way an immediate incitement, although I would argue from a psychological point of view that they're different because incitement usually involves at least some form of contemplation and decision making. Somebody tells me it's something terrible going on, I have to act. I have something. But when someone screams fire, it is almost an impulse, right? There's very actually little decision making that goes on. You know, it's part of the fear system of the brain that you run, right? And so there is some difference between them, but in both of them, language is inducing a behavior that's actually harmful. Now, even if I was to grant that there are cases of re-traumatization and that in some cases that re-traumatization was a legitimate reason to limit speech, let's look at what's happening on campus. It's a dangerous definitional expansion. We're all aware of definitional expansions. In fact, there are other words for definitional expansions. But first of all, I experienced trauma. My family experiences trauma. My group experiences trauma. A group I support experiences trauma. A group I support once experienced trauma. So it's a time expansion. right? And so I think that if we all recall the Cartesian axiom, I think, therefore I am, the students are telling us, I empathize, therefore I am traumatized. I think that is the psychological move. I empathize. That empathy of mine makes me vulnerable. It's Clinton's I feel your pain. And by the way, I teach my students that that is not clinical empathy, because you're feeling the other person's pain is actually stealing their position. It's not a constructive thing. You don't want to feel their pain. You want to be in the room with someone while they're feeling the pain, right? You don't take on the pain. So that whole idea that by empathizing, I take on your pain, certainly not by empathizing, I take on your pain, and therefore anybody who triggers that pain needs to be silenced, right, is already like 5 steps. You can see where this is 5 steps exaggerated from any kind of medical justification. I put in the to be sure because I think you always have to put that in. Okay, so to be sure, there are legitimate situations of this. Okay, so how does this go? Moreover, and here's the next step that happens. The discourse of trauma, for those who claim traumatization, it is granted to them an aura of epistemic privilege, right? So people who say, I am traumatized, I empathize with a group of traumatized, then in addition, what happens on the campus, in addition to their saying, therefore you can't speak because your speech will hurt me, there is also granted to them, by the way, my speech has some very special, right? I am a survivor, and that gives me some epistemic privilege. People are aware of this. This makes sense to you that there's a sense of epistemic privilege, right? This is my experience, right? The experience becomes more important. The emotional experience becomes more important than argumentation or factual material or anything like that. So it's an epistemic privilege, right? So even if the experience trauma, even if one has experienced no trauma, okay, the appropriation of others' trauma by means of identification, I'm claiming it's a voluntary, vicariously experienced trauma, nevertheless becomes a badge of virtue. See, where's a bag of virtue? I am taking on their pain, right? How virtuous am I for doing that? And that virtue gives me not only moral, but epistemic privilege, right? I am a knower by doing that. I'm a knower, and no one really should dare to contradict me, right? In addition, if that wasn't bad enough, any attempt to argue with that is claimed to be re-traumatization. So if I argue and I say, well, you're adopting this epistemic privilege on the basis of claiming empathy, oh my God, that already, right, falls into the category of re-traumatization. You know, by saying that you're re-traumatizing me, you are denying my thing. So I think an example was the college tent encampments that mimicked the lives of actually displaced people, right? That was a real piece of theater that mimicked those things. So this elevates the claim for banning speakers and opposing other points of view beyond the traditional hate speech arguments, okay? Because those rely on the possibility of potential harm sometime in the future, but this says the harm is, right, it is almost sophisticated constitutional argument, I would say. I don't know, Ellie, you can push back. But I think that it is actually kind of a sophisticated, it says it's real and present danger, right? It's imminent danger to me if you speak. Okay, so you guys please remind me, TD stands for trauma discourse. But with my current brain, every time I come up with an abbreviation, I forget what the abbreviation means a minute later. So it means trauma discourse. So trauma discourse, we've seen its particular function and a dynamic in radical campus culture. I hope I've shown that, right? It justifies censorship, etc. Okay, so this was the snowflake position. And this is essentially an expansion of John Haidt's original book. It's an expansion of snowflake position. But ladies and gentlemen, there is more. And this is something I call from snowflakes to hand grenades. And that is that to many observers, after the 10/7 terrorist attack, the nature of campus politics seemed to transform overnight from self-representation as hyper-vulnerable and the need for safe spaces into, and I think this is a fair phrase. Again, I checked this with Kerry Nelson. He agreed with me on this phrase, an exhilarated embrace of heroically framed violence and aggression, right? Which is very, very different than the snowflake position, right? So, and this was in full force, by the way, before the Israeli counterattack. I was on Columbia campus on 10/8, 10/9, all of weeks before, and that was already all there. So I named it From Snowflakes to Hand Grenades. And we're interested in understanding, what does this reversal mean? Is it really true that it reversed on that day? And I don't think so. I think that it tells us that we misunderstood the real depth, okay, of the discourse even before 10/7. So I want to identify the misuse now under that thing. So I think what's going on is there's an erasure of the distinction between speech and violence. And this goes in two directions. One I've already talked about. Remember, speech is absolutely protected. Violence, absolutely prohibited, right? These are the polar opposites. But since speech equals violence, your speech causes me violence, and therefore it can be shut down. That's what we've already talked about. I'm just reviewing it. However, I started out my life in math, so I know one thing about equations, okay, is that equations go in both directions, right? If A equals B, B is always also equal to A, right? I mean, it seems obvious, but people often will try to make equations and not take the other side into account. So if you switch the equation, and you notice that not only is speech equal to violence, but then violence is equal to speech. Well, does that happen on campus? And I'm going to say absolutely yes. Because the same thing that happened was that my violence to you in the form of interrupting classes, blocking doorways, destroying properties, physically blocking speakers coming in, right? Publicly celebrating field violence that takes place, that is claimed to be a legitimate form of expression. So not only is your speech violent to me and must be stopped, but my actual violence to you is just a form of expression. Right? So it's a double, right? It's a double distortion. It's a double distortion. It goes on all the time. If anybody wants to question that, this is the time, because I think that's sort of the key, one of two key insights, is that the distortion goes both ways. And it actually happens. It's actually almost unbelievable, right? That people will say, oh my God, if you say something, if there is a speaker from the opposite side, if there's a speaker here from, I don't know, Heterodox, or there's a speaker here who thinks that the trans programs are wrong, that will harm me. So speech there is violence to me. But when I block doorways, when I take things over, that's just a form of speech. And constantly people saying they're blocking my speech, right? So it's a double thing. So, as I did before, but that's not all. There's more. And the more is, what's the connection between all of this? Because there seems to be a connection here to the concepts of powerlessness, vulnerability and powerlessness. So I want to make a second claim. I want to say that actually both of these in this part of this equation are actually adaptations of battlefield asymmetric warfare. And I'll describe that in a moment. And that's been adopted to the campus as an overall strategy, right? So this contortion of snowflake versus hand grenade, speech equals violence, it points to the idea that the use of trauma narrative is only one part of a larger plan of adapting battlefield asymmetric warfare into campus. Now, when we talk about asymmetry in the battlefield, the word asymmetry actually has two meanings. What asymmetric means, well, you guys have all the power, right? I mean, this is sort of the justification of guerrilla tactics and of terrorism, right? You have all the power. That's what makes it asymmetric, because you have all the power, right? So then I have to come up with some way of fighting anyway. So, but the other asymmetry means I, therefore, have an asymmetric right to unconventional ways of fighting, including an abrogation of the rules, including an abrogation of the rules of war, right? So it refers to an approach adopted, namely ethical legal asymmetry, abrogation of traditional models of fairness and equity, right? Because the claim is made, those models that you are imposing on me, your rules for what is fair, rules of war, rules of engagement on a campus, those are all hypocrisy anyway. How do I know they're hypocrisy? Because I'm being oppressed. I'm being hurt by them. I'm being injured by them. These people are being injured by them. It's all hypocrisy, so I'm not going to follow the rules. So that is a huge shift, right? This adaptation of this means I not only am I claiming harm that doesn't exist, I am actually abrogating the entire system. I'm saying I don't have to, the system is unfair and I don't have to play by your rules, right? The powerless take power by moving the battle to an alternative dimension and justifying the asymmetry of breaking the rules. So let's just talk about what is battlefield asymmetry. It's a complicated thing, but let me just go through some of its key features, right? One, it justifies the use of physical violence while rejecting the traditional rules of violence, right? Number two, civilians of the opposition are legitimate targets, right? So it abrogates that rule. Number three, which there are two parts to number three. One is that civilians on my side can be used as soldiers. They can do the dying. They may not be able to do the fighting, but they can do the dying. I can use civilians on my side as the soldiers. And the third is that actually it gets a little blurry. The civilians on my side may be civilians one day and combatants the next day. I actually blur that difference between the civilians and the thing. So both battlefield, the fourth thing is that it enlists support from outside, that there's a lot of psych ops often involved in battlefield asymmetric warfare. There's a lot of psych ops, a lot of propaganda around it, an envelope around it, in addition to whatever's going on in the battlefield. Finally, and notice this is really, it occurred to me only this morning when I was going over it. Oh, this is actually part of the same thing. Battlefield asymmetric warfare, people don't wear uniforms, right? So people don't wear uniforms. Or they wear false flag uniforms. So they will put on hospital gown, or they, right? So, and when I say don't wear uniforms, I don't only mean clothing, but also, again, all of the trappings of what is identified. So abusing a journalistic identity, abusing a medical identity, right? The uniforms themselves are distorted. So this is the main slide of the talk. So let me go through it slowly. So how am I arguing that this is the same as the campus? The campus equivalent of battlefield asymmetric warfare works as follows. I'm going to propose to you that the tool of a soldier is violence. We have any disagreement that tools of a soldier is violence. The tools of civilians are supposed to be speech, right? Okay, nonviolent political activity. That is how we distinguish a soldier from a civilian. Civilians' only power is speech. Soldiers' power is violence. The erasure of the difference between speech and violence that I hope I've already convinced you of, I am now saying is parallel to, right? There's an isomorphism, if you like, between that and the erasure of the difference between soldier and civilian. Because if soldiers' power is violence and civilians' power is speech, and I erase those differences, then I've erased the difference. So what goes on the campus is the erasure between the difference between speech and violence is the same thing as in a battlefield, the difference between, the erasure of the difference between soldier and civilian. So now, a new abbreviation. I do remember it. It's campus asymmetric warfare. The power on campus is actually derived from physical violence. Now, they're always saying, whenever there's any kind of shutdown, you are shutting down our free speech. But it's not true, because it's not their free speech that's being abrogated. It is violence. And here it gets a little tricky, because a lot of the time it's actual violence. I think, blocking a door is violence, stopping students from going into a classroom and distributing literature in the middle of a classroom when someone else is teaching and going in there with a bunch of students, right? That's violence, right? Because that's terrifying for students, and that to my mind is an act of violence. But I also think tipping my hat to Gandhi. I also think that we have to think about another category in which I may not be committing violence, but I am demanding violence. In other words, I'm creating a situation in which only violence will oppose me, right? So the dynamics of speech is, I say it's day, you say it's night, right? So you get to oppose me with language, right? But there are some actions in which I can't oppose them with language. I have to oppose them with violence, right? So campus people have to bring in the police. So students claim it's nonviolent, but there's that funny place, right, where I'm creating a system of violence, even if people could argue whether or not I'm violence, and other places where it's out and out violence. So, okay, so again, this is the core insight that those erasures are the same way. So the campus encampment, again, I go back to the campus encampment, and I think that's an instantiation you can now see of battlefield tactics. And these elements distinguish campus activity as currently done and campus asymmetric warfare is not civil disobedience. I think this is a really key point, because I think especially those of us who grew up in the 60s and things like that, where it was mostly a form of civil disobedience and the theory was civil disobedience, I am claiming that's not true anymore. The theory is not civil disobedience. What's my evidence? Well, when students get arrested, they're like, how dare you arrest me? Right? I mean, that wasn't Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was, I broke the law, here are my arms. Right? So that wasn't the civil disobedience, the traditional thing of civil disobedience, right, was to break a law, to bring attention to the fact that that law is unjust, but while the law stands, to work under the rules of that law. I will be arrested. I will allow myself to be arrested. So these students aren't working under, whether they're completely conscious of it or not, I don't know, but they're not working under the rules of a traditional civil disobedience kind of protest. I think it makes the argument that this is much more like asymmetric warfare. So what's the goal of this? And I think there too, this is kind of a big lie. The adoption of these things is not to oppose particular university policies. It's not to get the universities to stop investing in certain firms or to have this or that policy. That is not the goal. The goal, and here I put a question mark and I say, well, maybe it's not the goal, maybe it's the effect. I'm gonna open myself up for argument. You can say this is not the goal, but this is the effect of it. In either case, the goal, or at least the effect, of campus asymmetric warfare is to eliminate open discussion, debate, discourse, and scholarship itself. Okay? It will likely involve the total delegitimization of the traditional epistemic and heuristic approach of a traditional university. Why do I say that? Well, precisely, if it's asymmetric warfare, it says that my actions are justified because your entire system is illegitimate, right? The asymmetry doesn't mean we're in a legitimate system and you have more and I have less. It's the asymmetry says the asymmetry derives from fundamental injustice, and I don't have to follow those rules of your fundamental injustice. It's everyone, I mean, you can argue with me now with that. So that's where I think it's a much deeper thing, and its adoption or toleration of it by universities is actually academic suicide, right? So let me point out that there's been a long history. This is not new. There's a long history of universities being mobilized to promote the ideology of a movement. Lenin and Hitler both successfully mobilized the universities in their time, right, to support their political movements. In both cases, the argument was made, the truth has finally been found. We know the truth. We don't have to search for the truth. That's not the purpose of your being a university. Lenin said this extremely explicitly, right? The universities are only there to disseminate this truth, again, be it fascism or be it Leninism, to the mass media and to support our movement in other ways. In both cases, so we have history for this, the universities and their students were at the forefront of causing terrible tragedies, right? So you had Heidegger, right? Say no more. So I am claiming that today's ideologues, and I'm going to put this more on the faculty, because the faculty has to be more aware of these kinds of differentiations and the differentiation between civil disobedience and asymmetric warfare. It's their responsibility to understand these kinds of differences, to notice these kinds of differences, to teach them. So I'm going to put it more on the faculty, but in any case, they all they're all responsible because they see the moral weight, just as Hitler and Lenin, they see the moral weight and immediacy of their cause as exceeding any traditional value of the university. So they will tell you, the value of the university, screw you, what are you talking about? What I'm fighting for is so much more. I am fighting for literally justice. Literally justice with a capital J. Oh, by the way, and a capital U, a capital... Okay, so that is the major argument, and I have two parts left. The part about fixes, like I said, I'm not going to go into because the other people are going to do potential fixes. The main concept of the fix here is what I'm arguing is that, well, I will get to it in the next slide. But, so I come from a medical approach, and in a medical approach, when we think we have we have come up with a diagnosis, one way of testing that is to see, well, does this diagnosis account for all of these symptoms that I've been dealing with, right? Does this diagnosis count for it better than the other one, right? If I say somebody has OCD versus depression, do they count? Oh my God, yes, they're checking things. It counts for them better. So I would want to say that once I accept, if I accept campus asymmetric warfare as being the underlying theory of what's going on, does it account for other things? And I'm going to say, yes, centrality of identity. Yes, that's there, right? Focus on power differentials, oppressor, oppressed, that's there. Equating words, right, with of your opponent as violence, that's there. The posture of fragility, that's there, right? The imperative and preeminence of activism, that is always, that is there. The redefining of activism into a more aggressive thing. Activism is not just words, but actually aggressive. That's there too. And accusing the university and then the US government and then the West of being collaborators in the blocking of world progress. So you guys are all things. So why should I support whatever university values you have? These university values are illegitimate. They are stopping the progress of the world. So what might be the implications of this? Can it help explain why current attempts are limited? And I don't mean to criticize anything that everybody is doing. You guys are all doing wonderful work to reverse what's happening on campus, but we have run up against barriers. And does this help with the barriers is the question. Does this diagnosis help with the barriers? And I want to say it does. First of all, it seems to me that it has some similarities with not so much trauma, but delusional disorder, right? Which is to say, in delusional disorder, the fixed belief cannot be dislodged by facts and arguments. So I want to say anybody who comes in to Heterodox and has a program of, I have a better argument as to why, it's not going to work, okay? Because delusions are not made out of facts and arguments. And asymmetric warfare is not made out of facts and arguments. It's made out of other stuff. So CAW rejects the tools of traditional university. I said that already. And naturally, those tools enable to dislodge it, right? It's more like, it's not even a worldview, it is a world, is what I want to argue with, even though I don't quite know what I mean when I wrote those words, but it just felt right. That it's not just a worldview, it's a world. It somehow is a universe unto itself. So, you cannot bring a disputation argument or a new set of campus policies to a declared knife fight in which the other side is bringing guns. Right? So this is not just bringing a knife, right? This is not just bringing a knife to things. This is bringing words, right, to something that the other side says, well, this is a knife fight. But actually, it's a gunfight because it's asymmetric warfare. So yeah, we lied to you, and we're bringing guns, not knives. That's a metaphor. I hope everyone gets that metaphor. So what is possible to do to combat it? And again, I said I have specific strategies, but this is kind of a theoretical overview of the approaches. And this is for those of you who are on campus, as I was 50 years ago or 60 years ago, through the 60s and through a lot of different international problems. The beautiful thing about the campus is that even though there were strong opinions on the campus, none of it was particularly violent. That was rare. It existed, but it was rare. But rather, there were spaces on campus for people talking about these things. So I want to say that the brutality of the actual current wars and injustices are sufficiently horrific in themselves without turning the campus into additional battlegrounds of these conflicts, without mobilizing the students as shadow battalions of those wars, which is what has been done, right? Does that help or harm, right? If when I do that, when I make the students into shadow battalions of those wars. If they want to do that, they should drop out of college. There are a lot of NGOs, a lot of places they could go and do that. But rather, the value of universities and their potential for improving the world, which is what these students claim that they want and what these professors claim they want, lies in their unique ability to be zones of demilitarized neutrality in which the search for knowledge and understanding can actually take place, in which debate and discussion between interested parties who have different views is tempered by agreed upon standards of rigorous research and discussion, leading to creative solutions and unexpected agreements. Okay? So, you know, black students, white students could sit down, and in my day we sometimes had strong arguments, and we'd sit down and discuss those arguments. The point was that we were off the battlefield. Recreating the battlefield in the campus is actually not only doesn't it help, but it's a tremendous waste of the one beautiful resource that you have in a university, right? To possibly open some conversations, right? And I think only this process may make a real contribution to peace and justice. And I claim the Academy was once like that. And I'm going to stop there, although I did bring a poem because I mentioned Carrie Nelson, so as many of you know, he's poetry. So what are we trying to defend? Only the human mind. Did anybody have anything interesting to say about the human mind? Well, Emily did, and she said this. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side. The one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for fold them blue to blue. The one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do, as syllable from sound. So thank you very much for your attention, and okay, let's start here. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about one of the things that's always thrown out is that I have generational trauma, and I'm curious from a psychological viewpoint, is that a balanced statement? Like I realize that they're just making it, but what is the origin of generational?
What really helps there is to talk about the difference between trauma, right? The difference between trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and re-traumatization. So these are very, very different things. Okay. So first of all, let's deal with the word trauma. So there was huge debates. Trauma has a fascinating place in the history of psychiatry because, of course, it was Freud's central insight, right? As he said, "Oh my God, my patients are suffering from memory." Right? This was Freud's, right? I mean, it was his in some ways his fundamental insight. So, trauma. We have to be careful with the use of the word trauma. So when the DSM came along and said we're throwing out Freud, we want to have something which has nothing Freud. The only disease, the only disorder in the whole DSM system which claims that it has a cause is post-traumatic stress disorder. None of the others have a claimed psychological cause. You say, okay, biology will figure this out, what causes it, right? But in trauma, only in PTSD was it said, well, it's preceded by a trauma, and then you have this disorder, okay? And so it defined trauma very strictly, okay? So that's the first thing we have to do is what is the definition of trauma, right? And the definition of trauma within the DSM, which they say by virtue of research, only with a trauma of this magnitude can you get PTSD, and those are yourself, experiencing actual physical harm or threat of death, or you're witnessing that, or you're hearing that about your family. So it is possible, right? If I hear, God forbid, that a close family member fell off, right, a mountain, then I can, according to DSM, be traumatized by that. But again, let's remember that most people, and the guy at Bonanno at the Teachers College at Columbia University has been the lead thinker about resilience, and he really points out that we talk about trauma too much, we don't talk about resilience enough. Most people are resilient. Most people who go through trauma do well, right? So most people do well. 80% of people who go through a trauma do not get post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So, you ask me if there's such a thing as generational trauma. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. Did that affect me? Did my mother's story affect? Absolutely, there's no question about it, right? It absolutely affected me. But it wasn't a trauma to me, and it didn't give me post-traumatic stress disorder. Every other diagnosis in the DSM, yes. It's given me half of those, right? But not post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? And by the way, there's another equation I want to say. Sometimes people who have trauma won't get PTSD, but they may get something else, right? So, I mean, we just published following up 1,000 kids who were at ground zero, right? There were 1,000 kids who were in and around ground zero, and we looked at them 14 years later, right? And then we compared them. We wanted to have a really tight control, not, just ordinary kids. So we picked kids in Brooklyn. We had 500 kids in Brooklyn, same day, right? But they weren't at ground zero. Twice as much psychiatric problems in the kids at ground zero, twice as much physical problems, and 4 times as much comorbidity. But not more PTSD, interestingly. 14 years later, it's not more PTSD. So I would say, yes, you know what? That's a terrible thing that happened to you, and it's terrible, and it's wonderful that you're empathic for it, right? But you can't be re-traumatized. You can't be harmed. You could be upset by somebody bringing it up, okay? Right? You could be upset by somebody bringing it up. I get upset when someone's a Holocaust denier, right? But I'm not injured in the way that would justify me to silence them. There may be other reasons to silence them, but not my injury from that. And we say, but that is it powerful? Oh my God, my head blows up. But again, I do not think that my head blowing up because of that justifies my silencing. It's not an immediate medical harm. Does that clarify?
Yeah.
Well, what if it went further and it wasn't an individual Holocaust denier, but you were in a system where Holocaust denial or Holocaust minimization was taught, and you were exposed to that messaging constantly, like erasing you or something called lived experience or your mother's lived experience? What would the effect of that be?
The effect of that would be, again, the effect of that would be very, very profound. But I would reject the medicalization of it. I would say it's a terrible thing, it's awful, and it needs to be considered in the discourse, okay? But don't bring in a medical diagnosis, right? Don't medicalize it and justify your silencing it, right, by medicalization. I mean, that's a terrible thing and has to be fought.
So there's a related concept called weathering, where people are subject to oppression and microaggressions continually, and they actually it does something to their cells that causes premature aging, which they call weathering, which is called weathering. It's a concept created by Arlene Geronis at the University of Michigan.
So there's very similar concepts also with children. So there's the adverse events of childhood, as people familiar with that as well. So are you asking me whether or not it is possible?
Is weathering a form of this related to what we're talking about? Is it the medical? Is that another way of medicalizing distress and creating a medical diagnosis out of social conditions?
Well, no. Okay. So I'm not. I don't want to pronounce on the legitimacy and illegitimacy of that. My tendency is to believe that that's true, right? That being involved, repeated. For example, if you grew up in if you grew up in the Raisin South, my wife grew up in the South, where we had black and white water fountains, right?
Yeah.
So if you grow up in that things, does that affect you? Does that affect you physically and emotionally? Absolutely, it does, right? That absolutely does affect you physically and emotionally, right? And can have a medical effect on you.
Right.
But right? I don't see how that medical effect would justify, under Supreme Court rules, to justify silencing anyone. So that's the question what we're talking about,
Yeah,
right?
and also-
In other words, so someone can get up and say, I've actually already been damaged by that. I wouldn't disagree. Yeah, you've already actually been damaged by that. And therefore, if there's somebody who wants to come to the campus and speak about something like that, or is underplaying that, right, or doing something like that, so don't go. But it doesn't give you, don't go if you don't want to go, right? Or protest against it with other words. But it doesn't, even what you're talking about, doesn't give you the right, as I'm arguing, right? Because it's not that kind of fire in the theater. It's not an immediate harm to you that would justify your silencing a speaker. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm not saying it's not a real medical thing, but it's not a medical thing that justifies this.
Yeah,
Okay, so that's two. Thank you for that, because it makes a distinction that I may have not made clear. That the two parts. One is that they claim medical harm, and the other is that the harm is immediate, right? Right, present and immediate, and therefore justifies silencing. So there's two pieces to it.
Yeah,
Now,
so it's an emergency.
Wasn't in Blair. Yeah.
A couple of thoughts. So,
No, go ahead.
First of all, I so appreciate this incredibly thorough and detailed presentation. It's super, super helpful. A couple of points I wanted to raise. One is, I think that what you're describing about trauma and the concept of trauma and its misuses, that point is extremely well taken. I think also your point about the justifications for violence in that framework, and in that mental space, you could say, or in that imaginary, is also critical. I would also at the same time caution against all of us sort of against hyper-focusing on essentially semantic arguments. So it may be that yes, all of this is true, and yet I think it's still helpful for us to step back and sort of try to look at, well, what's going on here, right? So what is, in a sense, being communicated by, say, the patient or the individual? And I think and I notice this in a generational context. I notice it often when I talk to people in their 20s or 30s, in particular about politics, and they just have no inhibition around the idea of disallowing not just certain forms of speech, but certain ideas, certain thoughts. And so I feel like we also need, and I think this is such a useful framework, but we also need to be able to pose the question and have the conversation about the idea that that it is legitimate to decide, or to basically decide certain ideas are not, just are not entitled to protections. And I think on campus in particular, I would also distinguish between the concept of violence and the concept of disruption. I think we can distinguish between those and also not minimize disruption, because I think you were starting to put your finger on something really important, which is effectively shutting down the speech, right, and also obstruction of the life of the university. Those are, I think, personally, I believe, should not be dismissed. They should not be trivialized. But I don't think we need to equate them with violence in order to take them seriously. And because I think what's expressed in the disruption, well, two things. I think the disruption is, people can easily argue that that is not violence, but the disruption is really about shutting down speech. And one other, which is really what the problem is. And I think it's the logic that legitimizes the shutting down of speech, which is really what we also want to be discussing. And I would also just add, one of the things I've noticed about, I think, which is somewhat generational, the trivialization of censorship, the idea that formal censorship is also legitimized in precisely the way you're describing. I think very often what people don't understand is that censorship is a mindset of the powerful, of the privileged, ironically, although it's often deployed in the name of the powerless, right, or the marginalized, the voiceless. And anyway, but I find your framework also extremely useful for thinking about some of those paradoxes, that if one identifies with a victimized group or experiences oneself as victimized, then they may feel that it is licensed and appropriate to shut down speech.
Right. So I started my education in yeshiva, and spent half of my day doing college, right? And so it's the second that because then you could say I could abuse this talk to justify hate speech, or to do various others. Ellie.
What you're describing is really, really important, but it seems to me and it is important to see that this is true not only on campus and about protests, but it's society-wide issues, that lots of issues of public dispute and argument are couched in medical terminology, whether it's rent control or bisexual, transsexual things, and then there's a whole profession called tort lawyers who essentially make a living of bringing these medical concepts into otherwise non-medical concepts. So why should campus be different if society only almost encourages and certainly lets it happen?
Yeah. Well, are you proposing, Ellie, that it went from society to camp? Well, right, it's a feedback loop, right, between the university and, right? Did the university see this for the society, or the other way around? You're suggesting that maybe the society seeded this for the university, and then
I think campus is echoing
echoing.
what's happening in society, but of course, people on campus also are opinion makers, and society is affected by it.
Yeah. So, no, I think that's very right, and I think it's interesting because I think that when you say that you're medicalizing something, I think there's two aspects to it that people cheat with, right? I mean, one aspect is that medical things represent harm, right? They represent identified harm, right? If I say that poor housing, as this gentleman said, poor housing or racial confrontation shorten your life, right? So that medicalizes, right, the problem of that medicalizes that problem. And I think there's two aspects to it. One aspect is the aspect of harm, that people, I think, use that because they say, well, you're not taking this seriously enough, right? But, if it has to do, right, because you don't care about my comfort, but you got to care about my lifespan, right? So in other words, it's used as a weight, right? Because it's we all agree that everyone has a right to their health. But the other piece of it is, even though there's now so much evidence denialism coming from the right now, but the other piece of it is that people have for a long time trusted medicine and trusted the idea, right, that medical categories have had tons of evidence to them, right? So one of the reasons I think people medicalize things is, and they cheat with this, is that they say, oh, it's medical, therefore I don't have to give you evidence that it's a problem. Because the evidence comes from the medicine, right? Even though they are not able to import the medical evidence, like in the PTSD thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but isn't it also true that the medical professions, public health, medical, psychiatric, also expand their own influence by telling society that these are medical issues and you really have to take them into account in order to critical moment?
Yeah, I do think, certainly I think that's happened. I think the expansion, right, from, from medicine to, public health is a wonderful thing, but the expansion from medicine to public health, to where public health, I think, has made some claims beyond its own evidentiary basis, right, about what policies should be, right? That will often happen. At Columbia University, I remember someone mentioned this the other day. They mentioned another professor, but should I mention a name? Anyway, don't need to mention a person's name. Did I already say a name? No, good. So I don't have to say that. Someone at our School of Public Health, who is supposedly a disaster expert during COVID, made the statement that people, after George Floyd was killed, that people should go out and demonstrate, and that it is a worse public health danger for society for people not to demonstrate than for people to go out and risk COVID. Well, a lot of people went out and risked COVID, got COVID, right? And so that was infuriating to me, right? Because he was speaking as a medical person, but he was just telling you what his personal political opinion was about things, right? And he was bringing in the weight of his medical, right? The weight of his medical title, and the weight of his public health title, in order to promote a political opinion. And yeah, that happens. And interestingly enough, that medicalization goes a bunch of ways right now. I mean, you can't go. Well, I'm not saying you can't go to any university, but certainly, for example, you know, at Columbia School, in the School of Public Health, you take certain courses, you know, you take certain courses, you will be taught that Israeli colonialism is responsible for these and those and the other ones of public health problems among particular populations. I mean, that will be taught as a medical thing rather than keeping it separate. So let me just tell you, and Alan, you know, because you know the traditional medical attitude, for example, that if there's a terrorist attack and there are survivors, you treat the victims and you treat the terrorists, right? The physician's position is to treat everybody equally, right? It is this radical removal, right? It's a radical removal, right, of any kind of political position from the healer's position, right? And I think what you're talking about is the opposite of that. It's bringing in my political views, right, at a societal level. But here's an example, even at a personal level, right? People treat. And I remember when I was doing this stuff with the 9/11 survivors. So one guy comes in and he says, Dr. AMSEL, I don't know what your background is, but look, I know that Jews were part of this 9/11 thing, that all the Jews were told to leave the building. No Jews died during 9/11, and Jews were part of this whole conspiracy, and the government's not telling us this. And I've been classically trained, and I said, you know, that's your political opinion. We're here to treat your PTSD, and let's get started, right? So in other words, I was classically trained. His political opinion had nothing to do with my medical, right, interaction with him. I don't know if I'm speaking or I'm way off where you started from. But it's that idea, right, of keeping medicine, right? Medicine needs, you know, I never thought of it. Now that you say that, I think these principles that we have talked about university neutrality, right? It's the neutrality, right? Medicine has to be neutral on political issues, right? And speak to the evidence it has, speak to the medical things it has, without expanding those into political positions. It has to be neutral on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to, well, I'm a psychoanalyst and even more Jungian. And I just want to speak to this issue of kind of medicalizing distress, you know, which I think your
Yes.
talk really gets into that. Because once we do that, it becomes medicalized, then it becomes politicized.
Yeah.
And we've lost the ability to kind of engage our own distress at the level of what it might mean symbolically or even finding meaning in it. We can't engage it at that level. And actually, if we have suffered trauma, if we do have PTSD, issues of meaning, like being able to make meaning out of our suffering is incredibly important for healing. So when we collapse that space and we just make it a medical and then a political problem, we've actually cut ourselves off from the source of healing.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's a wonderful point. And I'm going to take. May I run? As I say, with the since I'm the least athletic person in my family, I say, can I run with your football? So I'm going to run with your football, and I'm going to say yes, because what people do give it meaning, and the meaning is this externalized political meaning, and therefore they don't have to look at themselves, they don't have to examine anything else, and it's exactly the same Hitler-Lenin thing with the universities. We have the answer. Right, and you're right. It is an off-the-shelf, prefabricated answer to that distress. Yeah.
I think Lisa really great point out is something very similar. I was thinking very similar to what Lisa was just saying. A lot of things cause distress. You know, being a parent is distressful. Having a job is distressful. You know, being an activist, if you wanted to choose that as a category, is very distressful. Some of these things probably take years or months off of your life. So I guess you could medicalize that because it has a harmful effect on your person. But so I guess what I'm struggling with is what's the threshold for what should be considered a medicalized condition versus life? Is it, you know, should we think of that in terms of things that are done to us versus things that we choose? Is there a threshold in terms of the intensity of the distress or its effect on our physiology? Can you just help me think through that? How do you think about that? Where are the lines between?
Yeah, because life causes distress.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating topic. So let me first say, let's pull the politics out. Right. First boundary is right. If I'm going to medicalize something, don't then medicalize it and then right use that medicalization to then politicize it as well. Right. So that's an easier boundary for me. I would say that things have a price, right? Things have a price, right? So if parenting causes distress, right, and I choose to be a parent, I'm choosing that distress, right? And so I think that's one of the differences is to what extent have you had power? What extent have you had power over the cost and benefit and made a decision for yourself? And you said, yeah, this will cause me distress. Look, I found this research, it'll take a year off my life. Worth it, right? Worth it. Much better to have 1 year less than have these kids, right? So I think one place what we can start to think about it is what we think about it in terms of cost benefit and people having free choices to avoid that stress, right? So you can see in that case, you can avoid that stress. And other cases in which there isn't free choice, there isn't a possibility for avoiding it, or it's imposed by others, right? Or it's imposed, right? Because then it becomes more like it's imposed like a physical illness. Does that help begin to? No, but you're asking a big question, and
Yeah. So that makes sense, and I think that's one of the decisions we'll need to make. You know, is it something you chose or something that occurred? Something
yes.
That happened to you? But there also seems to be some threshold around, degree, extent, the effect on your person, either psychology or your physical well-being. How do we judge that? Where's the threshold we should be thinking? And it doesn't have to be a strict threshold, but
right. No, I got it.
What
So
determines?
I'll give you a second answer, okay?
Yeah.
And I'll give you a second answer is I use the word medicalization here, right? Because the way that the students use the trauma thing is they don't say it caused me psychological harm. They say it caused me harm, right? There's a slight blurring there, okay? And it's actual harm, and it is opening a wound, right? So I want to make a slight distinction between medical and mental health. Because I would think that in order to tackle the question the way that you asked it, we might need to make a distinction, right, between between somatic medicine, right, physical medicine, and mental health practice, right? Because in mental health practice, I think we have a much easier notion of treating people even if they don't have a disorder, right? I mean, we treat people because, they have a difficult marriage. It's not, you know what I mean? And it's not marital difficulty disorder. It's, they married the wrong person. It's, a husband's an asshole, right? So, but it just be, what's your, for billing purposes, we have to give them a diagnosis. But the truth is that, we are, we're rabbis, scholars, priests, we just, right? So I think the distinction is weaker in mental health where we cover things that are non-diagnosable, as long as we don't then misuse that. Yeah. You. I'm looking right at you, I'm sorry.
Traumatized.
I was told not to point.
Really good talk. I just wrote a book on the importance of overcoming a victim mindset and realizing your full potential. So this really jived with a lot of it. I was just thinking when you responded to what you said, because I talked about what is trauma, like how do we define it, and my colleague George Bonanno, I'm glad you mentioned him, calls them potentially traumatic experiences, not traumatic experiences, trying to reframe things in psychology to not, it's fascinating. You find fraternal twins who share 50% of the same genes, have the same exact experiences growing up. One grows up in therapy saying, my mother abused me and I'm traumatic, and the other child says, I had the most wonderful childhood experience ever. And what do you make of that? So in a lot of ways, trauma is a narrative. It's not in the body, it's in the mind, it's in the head. And stress is in the body, but trauma is not in the body, and some people are really kind of challenging that notion. But I wanted to say the idea of criteria, when you're a therapist, you would never think in terms of that. You would have a conditional positive regard, like what Carl Rogers calls. You would never be like to a patient, let me demote your experiences. You haven't met a criteria for trauma. You're just because you're coming here crying and life is disrupted and you're stressed out. It doesn't meet the criteria for counting as stress. What we do as therapists is really create a space where we give you the tools to cope, and we take your experiences as valid. And I'm so glad you make that distinction between the therapeutic kind of that approach and what's going on campus is a whole different story. It's a whole different story. But we have to keep these things apart and still keep our empathy without, saying, like rolling our eyes at people who are suffering and saying, oh, come on, it's just life. Even though in my book I did a section called Warning, you might have a case of life. That's me saying this, but I completely agree with it.
Yeah, I have, well, you first.
So my background,
Speak up,
yes, my background is in school psychology and special education, and I'm currently an associate dean director at Ohio University. And as I'm listening to this, I'm disturbed when I think about many of my colleagues in education. So they take theories that they've heard from psychology, and it appears in our textbooks, and sometimes theories that are very old and sometimes have been discounted and moved on, and they continue to teach them. And the trauma narrative right now is really pervasive in what we're telling people trying to become teachers about what's happening to kids in schools. And as I'm thinking, what suggestions do you offer for disrupting that narrative beyond what we've already discussed? Because I think then we're preparing children to think that they're victims and to think that every experience that they have is trauma that leads to severe damage, when focusing on resilience perhaps would be a much better strategy than some of the things. So I'm just wondering what thoughts or suggestions you have.
Well, I didn't get your name.
Scott.
So Scott and I wrote, I'm sorry, I don't know your last name for the book.
Scott Barry Kaufman.
Barry Kaufman?
Actually started Columbia in the fall, so we'll be colleagues.
Okay. Read his book. No, and my colleague Bonanno has a book. He talks about resilience. He talks about resilience a lot. I think John talks about resilience a lot in these books, both his books about the cognitive. He talks about resilience. So let me be clear. I just recently published a book where 1,000 kids, right, were 14 years ago exposed to a pretty serious trauma, right? 9/11 trauma. It still affects them. I'm not saying that no trauma ever affects a kid, but yes, it's been very. But as I said, first of all, I should point out that when I said there's twice as much trauma, I think so often. And this is one of the problems between research and marketing, and we market our research. We have built it, right? So like when I talk about this research, these kids had twice as much, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, it was 4% instead of 2%, right? It was twice as much. It was 4% instead of 2%, right? It was 8% instead of 4%. So it's still 90% that these kids are doing fine. So, but that's that. I think you know what I mean. So and I do think that somehow trauma has taken over and off. And I wonder whether it is not. It also probably has to do with safetyism, okay, and the notion of safetyism. And I think that we've gotten. I hate to use it, but we've gotten spoiled where the Grundgelagen, as they would say, our ground space is there are no risks in life and everything's going to be wonderful all the time, right? And so I think that we have, because I think, as Posner points out, this is the best time in history. We're doing much better, right? Fewer people are dying in wars actually today. Fewer people are dying of starvation. Believe it or not, that happened in the past. Per capita kind of stuff. So I do think there's a kind of a sense that we're traumatized, quote unquote, in the unofficial term. We're traumatized by anything bad happening. Yeah.
Sure. So, many thoughts, but for one, it seems like there's a fundamental not needing. I go later on the.
Okay, so I'm going to get his talk too.
So, that fundamentally we're not meeting kids' needs, and this dissatisfaction with them about life seems to be transferred into political, ideological things, and I think that the narratives that kids are hearing as they're growing up, back to the whole, like, we're not allowing them to get their needs, they're not getting, stressed along the way, and then they're, getting to a point where they should be adults, and they're really not. And I think if you look at Eric Hoffer's True Believer, you know, this is also, you know, after in previous times when there's been disruption in society, it's been the disaffected, disillusioned people that take up mass movements. And I have to think that, you know, people are trying to create a mass movement, and people are trying to say, hey, well, hold on here, you know, life is pretty good. We don't need to blow up this society. So I think it has come down to a few of those things. And I would also say, whenever you hear people mention ACEs and trauma and all this, you should be very skeptical of that. If you look deeper into that research, it's not as strong as people say it is. Of course, these ecological things and these traumas are real and have an impact, but they're using that. A lot of people in the medical field are making a name for themselves saying, oh, look at the ACEs, and therefore, because of that, ACEs are the adverse childhood experiences. So
ACE, adverse childhood experience. It's not a trauma. It's not a trauma necessarily, but
poverty with your parent, with
very
alcoholic,
positive, you know.
this type of stuff, and that these experiences are correlated with bad outcomes, yet the field seems to want to weaponize those experiences in order to make social policies and change things and put out narratives, and I think we're undermining our own credibility and potentially fueling a lot of disruptions on campus and ideology and politics and stuff. So, of course, you know, it's very disturbing, all these loops together, but what you put here was really compelling, and I had not thought about it in that way before. Very, very good.
Well, thank you. And you just gave me a thought as well, which is, you know, the stuff that John Hay talks about, which is the overprotection of kids. This stuff isn't helping the overprotecting of kids. When we tell people, oh, ACEs, right? If your kids have 3 ACEs, they're going to be screwed up for life, right? You know, I'm not letting them go to the playground, right? Because they might fall off the monkey bars, right?
People don't know that ACEs is a group metric. It's not an individual metric. Actually, the correlation between individual differences in ACEs and paddle is almost zero. It was only created to look at populations. People don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, and I've certainly, just as a clinician, you know, you see people with terrible litany of adverse childhood experiences who are thriving. So, you know, and I wonder sometimes we don't talk a lot about post-traumatic growth syndrome.
Post-traumatic growth, yeah. So let me say this. When I first came into the trauma field, what are you trying to say to me? Just say it out loud. Like,
just 1 minute.
1 minute, okay.
You guys can
All right, so here's the 1 minute thing. So when I first came into the trauma field, and I don't think this has changed, contradict me, anybody who knows better, I was taught that, you know, one of the risks for getting PTSD after a trauma is having been previously traumatized. One of the protective factors for not getting trauma after PTSD is having been previously traumatized, right? There was research that went both ways, that previous traumas help. And it depends on how you manage the previous trauma, it turned out, right? So if you had a trauma and you managed it well, you were going to manage the next trauma. So anyway, thank you all for your attention.